March 10th, 1793. James McLean is on his second voyage shipping cargo from Malmo to Grenada. He's a citizen of the United States, about to be impressed by the British Royal Navy. This is his story. I must begin a second part of my misfortune, which, if I were to detail at full length, would fill a large volume. But I shall study brevity, and only narrate some of the more prominent features of my sufferings, leaving it for an aftertime, to relate the same with more prolixity. We has no sooner let go our anchor, than an English man-of-war's boat came aboard and pressed me and two more seamen, and carried us aboard the Madras, 50-gun ship, commanded by John Dix, who immediately asked me for my protection. I immediately shewed him one from a notary public in New York, by the name of Keyes. He replied, I could get one if I was in America for half a crown as good as that. He further said, it is of no use for you to pretend that you are an American, for you was born in Scotland. The first lieutenant then stepped up and said, yes, that he was, for I knew his friends in Greenock. This is just but one of many instances of impressment. James could even be considered lucky when compared to what others went through. These illegal acts by Britain attributed to the start of the War of 1812 and formed the American national identity for decades to come.
The British Empire in the 18th century was really a maritime empire. As an island nation, they depended really heavily on trade and controlling really the trade of their various colonial territories. Well, for this to work, they needed a very powerful navy, and the navy needed men. And so British naval ships really sailed the world, but were especially concentrated in the Atlantic.
The Revolutionary War and the Battle of Saratoga left the British in desperate need of soldiers and sailors, leading to the creation of the Recruiting Acts of 1778 and 1779. While these laws focused on the impressment into the army, it set the foundations for naval impressment. When the Napoleonic Wars arrived in 1803, England once again faced a need for soldiers, especially sailors, which were needed to fight Napoleon's combined fleet, leading to an increase in the impressment of sailors, both British and American. To supply their need for sailors, England looked towards the Atlantic shipping routes and fishing industries, as they need sailors, not untrained men, to run a ship. The Royal Navy's focus was on British nationals who lived in the recently seceded colonies, men who had sought greater pay and better conditions in the American Navy and maritime industries. The proximity of these British nationals to the United States and the United States citizens led to many unfavorable encounters between the two nations. The Royal Navy began impressing the United States citizens. There are many reasons that the British may have begun impressing United States citizens. It may be because of the similarity of the English and Americans, or more nefarious reasons. Despite this, it is not important why the British began impressing the United States. The lasting impact was caused by the United States' reaction to the impressment. During this time, the United States was in a phase called the Early National Republic, a time of political and cultural tumult. Relations between the United States and England had just barely recovered from the Revolutionary War only 30 years before, and now, these actions, which from the Americans' views were acts of disrespect for the United States and its sovereignty, brought relations close to those of the Revolution. Tensions between the two nations continued to build, as more and more reports of impressment flooded in from the Atlantic. By the time impressment would be abolished, over 10,000 American seamen would be impressed into the Royal Navy. June 22nd, 1807, off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, James Barron is commanding the United States frigate, the USS Chesapeake. He was on his way to relieve the Chesapeake's sister ship, the USS Constitution, which has been patrolling in the Mediterranean. After leaving port, a British blockade noticed the ship and sent the HMS Leopard in pursuit. The Leopard hails the Chesapeake to prepare to be boarded, but the ship refuses. After a brief engagement, during which the Chesapeake only fires a single shot against two broadsides from the Leopard, James Barron surrenders the ship. The Leopard had a warrant from the Royal Navy to search for deserters, 3 of which were American citizens impressed into the Royal Navy. The attack on the Chesapeake spread throughout the young nation, causing great outrage against the British, the likes of which had not been seen since the Revolution. The stories of impressment and disrespect of sailors began to flood the papers. This Boston newspaper, from nearly 9 months after the affair, tells the story of an American merchant in China. This story shows the disrespect and righteous attitude the British naval officers regarded the Americans with. The writer depicts the moment of impressment. Captain Gilchrist replied that no man should be taken but himself. Captain Kempthorne ordered his seamen to seize some of the crew. Then Kempthorne directed them to seize Gilchrist. They next tied a rope around his second officer and threw them overboard, and dragged Gilchrist on board the Diana. While this article is a political piece supporting a running governor, this fact only supports how prevalent the issue had become.
And various people wanted to explore whether this was actually legal. Could the British actually capture men and put them on ships? And so we have records from the early 1770s of Benjamin Franklin educating himself and reading one of the leading rulings that said impressment was legal. And he wrote on the margins of this ruling all kinds of sarcastic comments against really the whole British system of government, which he decided that if this was legal, then it showed that it didn't really support liberty.
This chart shows thousands of impressed sailors. Lack of information on most prisoners shows not only the lack of documentation at the time, but also the tendency of the British to not acknowledge the identity of these sailors. Henry Cross from on board the Elephant was impressed on November 5, 1805, even with a clear citizenship from a customs house. This chart lists thousands of impressed sailors. Throughout this document, we see the reasoning behind the British refusal to release impressed men. Despite some of these remarks seeming preposterous, they did give some justification to impressment. One common reason listed is having no documentation to prove his citizenship, which included men such as Henry Cross, who did indeed have documentation, called protection, but were dismissed. This document is a perfect example of the widespread disrespect that the British had for Americans and their government.
Impressment was often compared to slavery in its own time. The systems were different, but they had some similarities. When a sailor was impressed, we have some first-hand accounts. They often likened themselves to enslaved Africans.
In response, Jefferson put forward and enacted the Embargo Acts of 1807, which banned all exports of the United States in an effort to keep the United States neutral in the Napoleonic War and to limit the contact between United States sailors and the British Navy. The Embargo Acts were a form of economic warfare, as England relied heavily on the American resources due to Napoleon's continental system. The Embargo Acts, however, failed, but furthered the mental divide between the two nations.
Some of the merchants in the Northeast looked to the British as their great friends in commerce, but other Americans are very aware of a sense of animosity that lasts for decades between the two countries.
The United States had grown tired of these encounters with the British. The Americans and the British, who were close due to shared cultures, religions, languages, and histories, now felt the divide not seen since the Revolution. Many called for a second war of independence. Americans had grown tired of Britain's power over the young country. Washington was at a breaking point. With Europe caught up in Napoleon's rule, and with Britain oppressing American sailors, the United States was alone and soon learned that it could only ever depend on itself, leading to an isolationist mentality. Because of impressment and other influences, James Madison broke and declared war on June 1st, 1812. The Congress of the United States, by virtue of the constituted authority vested in them, have declared by their act, hearing date the 18th day of the present month, that war exists between the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and the dependencies thereof, and the United States of America and their territories. After 2 long years of war, during which many lives were lost, on Christmas Eve of 1814, the United States and Great Britain signed the Treaty of Ghent, ending the War of 1812, and with it, impressment. Impressment and all its effects, including the War of 1812, deeply impacted the American mentality. The United States' first true encounter with European military affairs, and the schism created by the conflict, led the United States down a path of intense nationalism and near total isolationism. The United States' isolationist and European neutrality policies would fade away over time, finally ceasing with World War II. But the intense nationalism that developed all those years ago is still firmly present in our nation today. Impressment truly was a formative force in a politically explorative time.
There's a lot of lessons that we can really take from the issue of impressment and how it worked during the 18th century. I titled the book The Evil Necessity because Britain found itself really in a compromised position. In order to establish and continue the world dominance that it had, it in essence had to violate one of its own principles. The British were really associated with liberty in the 18th century, something that as Americans we sometimes forget. And so when they resorted to impressment, this system that was so controversial and for so many was the opposite of liberty, in a sense they violated one of their primary ideals. I see it as a lesson really for all societies going forward, thinking about what their values are and what's necessary for them to continue their way of life and whether it's worth it.